Chapter 1: The Devil's Bride. 2,000 years ago, in a land where empires rose and fell with the whims of fate, there was a village untouched by war but haunted by whispers. In this village, beneath the eternal gaze of the moon, lived a woman named Liora. Her beauty was unnatural, her eyes like polished obsidian, her hair as dark as a raven's wing, and her presence both captivating and unsettling. Some said she was blessed by the gods, others believed she was marked by something far older, far more dangerous. Liora was unlike the other women of the village. While they tended to their homes and families, she often wandered alone, seeking solace beneath the canopy of ancient trees or by the shores of the river that cut through the valley. There was an air about her, something that made the elders clutch their charms of protection tighter when she passed. The children, though curious, never dared to meet her gaze for long. But it was not mere superstition that set her apart. Liora herself felt it, the pull of something unseen, an inexplicable connection to the unknown. There were nights when the wind carried whispers only she could hear, voices that seemed to call her name from the darkness. Her mother, before she passed, had once warned her, "You must never listen, my child. There are things in this world that should not be answered." But the warning had come too late, for Liora had already listened. And she had already begun to wonder. One fateful evening, when the air was thick with the scent of rain and the sky was painted in hues of crimson and violet, she felt the call stronger than ever before. It was not a voice this time, but a pull, a beckoning deep in her bones. Without thinking, without questioning, she followed. Through the twisting trees she walked, her bare feet brushing against the damp earth, the leaves whispering secrets as she passed. The further she went, the more the world around her seemed to shift. The air grew heavy, thick with something unseen, and the once familiar path twisted into something foreign. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the moon above seemed to dim. And then she saw him. He stood in the clearing, draped in darkness, his presence a force that bent reality itself. The trees twisted away from him, the stars above flickering as though afraid to shine in his presence. His face was obscured, yet she felt his gaze upon her, deep, knowing, and ancient beyond comprehension. His voice was silken fire. "You have called me, whether you know it or not." Liora should have run, should have screamed, but she did neither. Instead, she met his gaze with defiance, though her heart pounded with something between fear and fascination. "I have called for no one," she said, though her voice wavered. The devil, though no one dared to speak his name, laughed softly, a sound like the crackling of embers in a dying fire. "You were always meant to be mine." From that night onward, he was never far from her. He came to her in dreams, his presence weaving through the fabric of her existence. At times, she would wake to find the room colder, the candle flames flickering without cause, the feeling of unseen eyes watching her from the shadows. And yet, she was not afraid. He spoke to her of things no mortal should know, secrets of the stars, the whispers of forgotten gods, the power that lurked beneath the skin of the world. He promised her knowledge, power, eternity. And, most of all, he promised her a love that would shake the heavens themselves. Against all reason, against all warnings, Liora listened. And she fell. The night she gave herself to him, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sky burned crimson, and the very earth trembled beneath their union. Lightning split the heavens, the wind howled through the trees, and the river, once calm, raged as if in protest. When the storm passed and the night returned to silence, Liora stood forever changed. The shadows clung to her, the air around her crackled with unseen energy, and in her womb, something beyond mortal understanding had begun to stir. Thus, the devil took a bride. Chapter 2: The Birth of Ruin. The months that followed Liora's fateful union with the devil were unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. From the moment she conceived, the village began to change. The air itself seemed heavier, charged with an unnatural energy that made the hairs on the back of one's neck stand on end. The elders, wise and weathered by time, spoke in hushed tones, their voices laced with apprehension. They had seen many births in their time, but never had they sensed something as ominous as this. Women of the village whispered in secret gatherings, crossing themselves and muttering prayers as they spoke of Liora's unborn child. It was not the swollen curve of her belly that frightened them, nor the quiet confidence with which she carried herself, it was the unexplainable phenomena that followed her wherever she went. The animals were the first to react. The village dogs, once loyal and affectionate, now slunk away with their tails between their legs, howling in the dead of night at something unseen. The cattle refused to graze when Liora passed, their eyes rolling with fear, as if they beheld something in her that no human could see. Birds, which once filled the trees with song, had gone silent, their lifeless bodies sometimes found strewn along the path she walked, as if nature itself rejected what grew within her. The people of the village avoided her, though none dared voice their fear to her face. They saw how the shadows in her home moved when she was still, how the candle flames bent toward her as if drawn by an invisible force. The midwives who should have attended to her pregnancy made excuses, their hands trembling as they refused to step inside her dwelling. It was said that the moment her child quickened in her womb, the night grew longer and the winds colder. As the months passed, Liora found herself growing more isolated. She sat alone in her small stone dwelling, running her hands over the unnatural warmth of her belly. She could feel the life within her, powerful and restless, a presence that filled her with both love and a fear she could not name. Though she knew in the depths of her soul that no mortal man had fathered this child, she refused to believe he was a curse. He was hers, and she would love him, no matter what the world said. Then came the night of his birth. It began with a storm unlike any the village had ever seen. The sky, which had been clear moments before, turned as black as ink, void of moon or stars. Winds tore through the trees, bending them at unnatural angles, and the very earth beneath the villagers' feet seemed to shudder. Liora's screams shattered the night. Inside her home, she writhed in agony, her body convulsing as waves of unbearable pain racked her frame. The air was thick, suffocating, laced with the scent of fire and something darker, something ancient. Shadows slithered along the walls like living things, flickering unnaturally in the dim candlelight. The midwife, the only woman who had dared stay, trembled as she knelt beside Liora, sweat pouring from her brow. She whispered prayers under her breath, but her words faltered as she met Liora's gaze. The mother-to-be was not simply in pain, she was glowing, her skin pulsing faintly as though something beyond human coursed through her veins. Her obsidian eyes were wild, filled with something deeper than pain, something primal. Then came the final scream, and with it, an eerie silence. The midwife gasped, her breath stolen from her lips. She clutched her chest, her eyes rolling back into her skull, and before she could utter another sound, she collapsed to the floor, lifeless. Liora, panting and drenched in sweat, lifted her head to see the child cradled in her arms. The storm outside raged on, but inside the small chamber, an unnatural hush settled. Her heart pounded as she looked down at the infant wrapped in blood-stained cloth. He was unlike any newborn she had ever seen. His skin was pale as untouched snow, but his eyes burned like embers, glowing in the dim light. The child did not wail like other newborns. Instead, he merely opened his mouth, and though no sound came, the entire room seemed to shudder with the weight of his presence. The air around him carried the faintest scent of brimstone. A shiver ran down Liora's spine, but it was not from fear, it was from something far more dangerous, awe. The village priest, having heard of the storm and the unnatural silence that followed, arrived at the doorway, flanked by men clutching their crude weapons. His face, normally filled with a gentle wisdom, twisted in horror as he laid eyes upon the child. He clutched the talisman around his neck and whispered, "This is no child of man. He is the seed of ruin." His words carried across the room, and though the newborn could not understand them, the flames of the candles flickered violently, their glow intensifying for the briefest moment before dimming to near darkness. The priest's fingers twitched, his breath catching as an invisible force pressed upon him, as though the very air had become hostile to his presence. Liora held the child closer, her exhaustion forgotten in the wake of the priest's words. "He is my son." Her voice, though weak, carried a strength that defied the weight of the accusation. The priest took a step back, his fear evident. "You do not understand what you have brought into this world." Liora did not respond. She only stared at the tiny face in her arms, at the glowing red eyes that, for the briefest moment, softened as they met hers. He was not a monster to her. He was her child. And she, no matter what the world said, would love him. She brushed a trembling finger against his cheek and whispered his name. Kael. The name echoed in the room, as if the very walls had taken it in, sealing it into the fabric of reality itself. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within Liora's arms, a new storm had been born. The world would soon come to know his name, for he was not destined to be forgotten. He was a being unlike any other, a force that would shift the course of history. And this was only the beginning. Chapter 3: The Mark of Darkness. Kael was no ordinary child. Even in his infancy, shadows clung to him like a second skin, writhing and shifting in unnatural patterns whenever he moved. By the time he could walk, the air around him grew thick and heavy, as if the world itself recoiled from his presence. The villagers spoke in hushed whispers, refusing to meet his gaze. Mothers pulled their children close when he passed, and old men made signs of protection when they heard his name. At first, Liora told herself it was nothing more than fear and superstition. But deep in her heart, she knew Kael was different. When he was barely 2, she had awoken one night to find him sitting upright in his cradle, his crimson eyes glowing in the dark. The shadows in the room twisted unnaturally, and the night's air reeked of sulfur. As she reached for him, he whispered a word in a language she did not understand, and for a moment, the stars outside seemed to flicker. By the time he was 3, strange occurrences followed wherever he went. Milk curdled in its pail before it could be brought inside, metal rusted overnight, and doors locked from the inside without anyone touching them. Birds fell dead mid-flight when his laughter rang through the village, their fragile bodies shattering upon the ground. The villagers no longer called him by name, they spoke of him as the marked one, the cursed son, and sometimes, in fearful reverence, the harbinger. It was when Kael turned 5 that the people of the village decided they could endure no more. The harvest had failed, the river had turned black, and the air carried an unnatural chill even in the height of summer. The priest, a man who had once blessed Liora's birth but now feared her son, called for a gathering at the village square. His voice was heavy with sorrow and dread as he spoke. "This child is not of this world. We have seen the signs, death follows where he walks, and ruin clings to him like a shadow. If we do nothing, we will all perish." The people, driven by fear, gathered torches and sharpened their pitchforks. They marched to Liora's home, their faces hard with resolve. They would do what had to be done. Liora stood at the threshold of her house, her arms wrapped tightly around Kael as the mob closed in. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her voice was steady as she cried out, "He is just a child. My son. He has done nothing." But the priest stepped forward, his voice edged with sorrow and steel. "Not yet. But he will." The first man took a step forward, then another. Kael clung to Liora, his small hands gripping her dress. She felt the tension in his tiny body, the tremor in his breath. And then, it happened. A terrible force erupted from the boy, unseen yet felt in every soul. The torches went out at once, plunging the world into darkness. A cry, not from Kael's lips, but from the very air itself, rose in an anguished wail. The villagers screamed as an invisible wave of power surged through the village. Houses collapsed as if crushed by an unseen hand. The earth split open, swallowing some where they stood. Fire erupted from nothing, consuming everything in its path. The priest fell to his knees, clutching his chest, his breath stolen by the overwhelming force. When the chaos finally settled, silence fell. The village, what remained of it, was a wasteland of ruin. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying the scent of charred wood and flesh. Bodies lay scattered, some crushed, some burned, and others simply lifeless, as though the very breath of existence had been stolen from them. Only 2 figures stood amidst the devastation, Liora and Kael. The boy's crimson eyes, filled with neither sorrow nor joy, reflected the smoldering wreckage. He did not understand what had happened, not fully. But Liora did. They could never return. Clutching Kael to her chest, she turned from the ruin of her home and walked away, her bare feet leaving prints in the ashes. From that day forth, they were wanderers, exiles upon the earth. No village would take them, no shelter would welcome them. They traveled from land to land, moving under the cover of night, always fleeing before the whispers of their coming could catch up to them. Yet, with each step Kael took, the world changed. The land where he walked grew barren, the sky above him darkened, and the whispers of the wind spoke of ruin yet to come. The mark upon him could not be hidden, nor could it be denied. The child was no longer just a child. He was an omen, a prophecy, a force that no man could hope to control. And the world would come to fear the name of Kael. Chapter 4: A Child Among Men. Kael was no ordinary boy. His birth alone had been a portent of doom, and as he grew, the world around him seemed to warp in response to his presence. He was a child of uncanny beauty, and yet, there was something unsettling about him, a heaviness that seemed to hang in the air whenever he was near. His eyes, red as the embers of a dying fire, held an abyssal depth that no mortal soul could ever hope to understand. It was as if the darkness itself lived within them, quietly pulling the very light from the world. When he looked at anyone, they felt a profound sense of dread, as if staring into the eyes of something ancient, something that had existed long before the world was formed. As Kael grew older, the strange disturbances that surrounded him only intensified. He was no longer a helpless infant in his mother's arms, but a creature whose very existence defied the natural order. The people who encountered him could not look at him without feeling a cold shiver run down their spines. The air would grow heavier in his presence, thick with an energy that seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm. It was as though the world itself, in all its natural beauty and chaos, recoiled in fear of the child who bore the mark of ruin. By the age of 10, Kael had become a figure of legend. Whispers of his strange powers, his ability to shape the world around him with nothing more than a glance or a word, spread far beyond the borders of the village where he had been born. His very existence seemed to provoke events of unexplainable nature. Crops withered in his presence, rivers flowed dry, and even the birds seemed to shun the sky when he wandered beneath them. The world had begun to bend to his will, not because he sought it, but because his mere existence had a way of distorting the fabric of reality itself. Kings and powerful rulers, upon hearing of him, began to seek him out. Some wished to harness his power for their own ends, to use him as a weapon to secure their reigns, while others, fearful of his growing influence, hoped to destroy him before his presence could bring ruin to their lands. It is said that Kael's name traveled to distant empires, kingdoms where the very mention of his title would send the bravest of men into fits of trembling fear. They had all heard the rumors, the stories of cities brought to their knees, entire armies driven mad, and lives ruined by the mere whisper of Kael's name. The first king to seek Kael out was a ruler of great ambition, one who sought dominion over all the known world. He had heard the tales of the devil's son, and he believed that he could control such power, that he could use Kael to crush his enemies and secure his place as the most powerful man to ever walk the earth. He sent emissaries to the village where Kael and Liora lived, and when they arrived, they found her alone. Kael was nowhere to be seen, though his presence was felt in the very air around them. The king, undeterred by the eerie stillness of the land, sent his soldiers into the forest in search of Kael. They found him standing beneath an ancient tree, the roots of which seemed to twist and writhe as though they had been touched by dark forces. The boy stood motionless, his red eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, watching them with an almost predatory gaze. When the soldiers approached, they were struck by an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something inside them had been touched by something far darker than they could comprehend. Kael said nothing as the soldiers circled him, but they could hear his voice in their minds, soft and powerful, like the wind itself whispering its secrets. His words were simple, but they carried an undeniable weight. You seek to control the storm, but the storm will never be yours to command. The soldiers, already unnerved, hesitated, and in that moment, the air around them seemed to shift. The ground beneath their feet cracked, and a dark shadow spread from Kael's feet, engulfing them in an instant. The soldiers screamed in terror, their cries echoing through the forest, but none of them escaped. By the time the king's emissaries arrived to see what had happened, all that remained of his men was a twisted, charred ruin, bodies scorched and broken, their faces frozen in eternal terror. It was then that the king himself, having heard of the fate of his soldiers, made the decision to confront Kael. He marched into the forest with an army at his back, determined to end the threat once and for all. But when he came face to face with the boy, he was struck by an undeniable sense of helplessness. Kael's gaze met his, and for a moment, the king felt the weight of an eternity pressing down upon him. The world seemed to stand still, and in that frozen moment, the king realized the futility of his mission. Kael was not just a weapon, he was something far older, far more dangerous. With a single word, Kael spoke, his voice deep and resonant, "Leave now, or be lost." The king's army hesitated, their resolve faltering in the face of such power. None dared to draw their swords. The king, trembling beneath the weight of Kael's gaze, gave the order to retreat, and his army fled in fear. Yet Kael did not pursue them. He merely watched them go, as if their presence meant nothing to him. He had not sought their destruction, he had simply shown them that they could never control him. After that encounter, many kings and rulers would send emissaries to Kael, hoping to bend him to their will, but each failed. Those who sought to destroy him met worse fates than those who sought to use him. Some of the greatest minds of the age tried to unravel the mystery of his existence, and they too were consumed by the power that he could not control. Entire cities fell into despair, as the very fabric of their societies unraveled in the wake of his presence. It was not that Kael actively sought to destroy, he merely existed, and that was enough. But Kael never sought to rule. He did not revel in the suffering that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He never laughed as the cities burned or as the armies fell. In fact, Kael was strangely indifferent to it all. He did not seek power, nor did he understand the concept of ruling over others. His existence was a paradox. He was both the destroyer and the one who could never be destroyed, a living force of nature beyond mortal comprehension. The world bent to his will not because he desired it, but because his mere presence warped the very laws of existence. His thoughts seemed to echo through the air, bending the world to his whims without him ever lifting a finger. The wind shifted when he willed it, the stars dimmed when his mood grew dark, and the earth trembled when his heart felt anger. The world was not being destroyed, it was being reshaped by the weight of his existence, and nothing could stop it. Kael had become a being beyond the comprehension of man. He was a child among men, yet he was not truly one of them. The very essence of his being was not of this world, and as he wandered through it, he left a trail of devastation that no one could fully understand. In his wake, there was no joy, no sorrow, only a vast, empty void that stretched across the land. He had become the embodiment of ruin, not because he sought it, but because his existence was a force too powerful for the world to contain. As he continued his journey, Kael found himself increasingly isolated. The very people who had once sought his power now shunned him, and he wandered alone, an outcast in a world that could neither understand nor control him. And yet, despite the destruction that followed him, despite the terror that his presence inspired, Kael never ceased to search for something, a connection, a meaning beyond the endless cycle of chaos that surrounded him. But that search would prove to be a lonely one, for in a world where nothing could stand against him, Kael's greatest curse was that he was doomed to exist without purpose, forever adrift in a sea of darkness. And so, the devil's son wandered, neither seeking power nor desiring companionship, but simply existing, an unsettling presence in a world that could never truly accept him. Chapter 5: The Gathering Storm. A whisper had begun to circulate among the great halls of power. It started as a faint murmur, but as the months passed, the voices grew louder and more insistent. A shadow had fallen over the world, and the very earth seemed to tremble under its weight. It was a fear that no one could truly explain but felt deep in their bones. Prophets, those who claimed to have glimpsed the threads of fate woven by unseen hands, rose from every corner of the world, each bearing the same message: there was a great calamity on the horizon, a storm that would tear through the fabric of the world itself, and at its center stood Kael, the son of the devil. The stars themselves seemed to conspire against the world. Astronomers and sages, who had once charted the heavens with certainty, watched in horror as the constellations shifted and moved as though they had been disturbed by an unseen force. Night after night, the sky flickered with unnatural brilliance, stars blinking out and reappearing in strange formations. The old prophecies were dredged up from dusty tomes and forgotten scrolls, their ominous prediction stirring in the hearts of kings and commoners alike. The sun seemed dimmer, and the winds no longer carried the same life-giving breath. The earth, once fertile and full of promise, now seemed barren, as if the world itself had begun to die. In every city, in every kingdom, fear took root. Great empires that had once stood invincible began to tremble at the thought of the coming storm. The ancient civilizations, whose armies had swept across continents and whose rulers had held the fate of nations in their hands, now found themselves facing an enemy unlike any they had ever known. It was not an army that could be fought with swords or armies that could be broken with strategy. It was a force that could not be understood, a terror that could not be reasoned with. Kael was not just a boy, not just a weapon. It was as if he were the embodiment of something much larger, something far older, something that had no place in the world of men. The whispers became frantic, spreading through every court, every royal household, until the greatest minds of the age were in agreement. Armies were gathered, but not to fight each other. No, these armies marched with a singular purpose: to confront Kael. They did not know how to kill him, but they knew that they had to stop him before his influence grew too great. Kings and emperors, once proud and resolute, now cowered in the shadow of a child. They pooled their resources, their armies, their best strategists, and yet none could devise a plan to face the impossible. They had seen what Kael could do: cities reduced to ashes with a mere thought, entire armies driven mad by a glance, and great men falling to their knees in hopelessness at the very sight of him. They did not know how to stop him, but they knew they had no choice but to try. In the midst of the gathering storm, the devil watched from his darkened throne, a satisfied smile curving across his lips. He had been patient, biding his time, and now, finally, his son had become the harbinger of the age of chaos he had longed for. Kael had become more than just a tool. He was a force of nature, a living manifestation of destruction. The world would burn, and in the ashes, the devil would reign. He had seeded the earth with a force that could not be contained, a son whose very presence was enough to unravel the delicate threads of fate itself. The heavens would tremble, the earth would crack, and in the end, only the devil would remain to claim the broken world as his own. But there was one person who refused to accept Kael's fate, one heart that could not give in to despair. Liora, the mother who had borne him, the woman who had loved him fiercely and without reservation, was heartbroken. She had raised her son with love, despite the darkness that clung to him, and she could not bear to see him become the instrument of the world's destruction. No matter how much the world trembled, no matter how much the forces of darkness rallied against them, she could not accept that this was Kael's destiny. There had to be another way. There had to be a chance for him to break free from the terrible inheritance that coursed through his veins. Liora's heart was torn between the love she had for her son and the dread that shadowed his every step. She could feel the world's hatred growing, could hear the whispers of those who sought to destroy him before he could become the monster they feared. But she did not want him to be a weapon. She did not want him to be a destroyer. She wanted him to have a life, to choose his own path, free from the curse of his bloodline. In her grief, Liora turned to the gods. She had once rejected their power, believing that no divine force could offer her solace in a world so steeped in suffering, but now she had no choice. She had to believe that there was something greater than fate itself, something that could undo the chain of events that had brought Kael into the world. She wandered far from the cities, seeking out hermits, mystics, and scholars who might hold the key to saving her son. She pleaded with them all, she begged, she bartered, she made sacrifices, but every answer she received only deepened her despair. No one could undo what had been done. The blood of the devil ran through Kael's veins, and no power on earth could sever the bond between father and son. Desperate, Liora turned to the ancient magic that had been hidden from the world for centuries. In the deepest caverns, she found a being of immense power, a seer who claimed to possess the ability to see beyond time, to peer into the threads of fate itself. She offered herself in exchange for knowledge, willing to pay any price to save her son. The seer, ancient and wise beyond measure, gazed into the future and saw the tangled paths that Kael might walk, paths that led to both ruin and redemption. But she spoke in riddles, her words cryptic and impossible to understand. The heart that was torn can be healed, the seer whispered, but the cost will be great. The stars will not bend for you, but the winds of fate can shift if you know where to stand. Liora clung to those words like a lifeline. There had to be a way. There had to be something she could do to change the course of her son's destiny. But the more she searched, the more she realized that fate was a force that could not be manipulated. Her love for Kael was powerful, but it was not enough to rewrite the past or undo the curse that had been laid upon him. As the world around her braced for the storm that Kael would bring, Liora refused to give up. She did not have the power to change the world, but she would fight with every ounce of strength she had to save her son. No matter how impossible it seemed, no matter how the world twisted and turned in response to Kael's growing power, Liora would never stop searching for a way to sever the ties that bound him to the darkness. She would face the storm, and even if it consumed everything in its path, she would not allow her son to become its harbinger. The storm was gathering, the winds of change blowing stronger with each passing day, but within the heart of a mother, there burned an unwavering hope that there was still a way to save her son, even in the face of the inevitable destruction that lay ahead. Chapter 6: The Wrath Unleashed. The world had turned against Kael, and in his anguish, Kael turned against the world. It was not a conscious choice, not an act of malice or conquest, it was instinct, raw and unrelenting. The weight of betrayal, the certainty that no place would ever welcome him, ignited something within him that had been buried for years. A power beyond human comprehension, a force that had always lingered beneath his skin, waiting, watching, biding its time. And when the final betrayal came, when the last refuge he had known cast him out, the floodgates broke. It began with a whisper in the wind, a ripple in the fabric of reality itself. The sky darkened without warning, as if the heavens recoiled from what was about to unfold. The air grew thick, heavy with an unseen force, pressing down upon the earth like an impending storm. Then, with a single breath of Kael's fury, the heavens shattered. A jagged rift tore across the sky, a wound in the firmament that bled fire and ash. Lightning, black as midnight, cracked across the horizon, striking down cities as though the gods themselves had forsaken the world. The ground trembled beneath his feet, mountains groaning and splitting apart as rivers boiled into steam. What had once been fertile lands turned barren, the very soil rejecting life itself. And then came the storms. Fire rained from the heavens, not as a fleeting storm but as an unrelenting deluge. Great cities that had stood for centuries, symbols of civilization and grandeur, crumbled to nothing within hours. Towers that had once scraped the sky melted into rivers of molten stone. Temples where men had prayed for salvation burned with an unholy light, their God silent in the face of Kael's wrath. The seas, once teeming with life, became nothing more than vast expanses of poison. The waters, once blue and endless, turned black and thick, suffocating all who dwelled within them. Ships that had dared sail upon them dissolved, their wooden hulls rotting in seconds, their iron rusting to dust before the sailors' dying screams could fade. The oceans, like the rest of the world, had succumbed to the fury of the devil's son. Armies that had once marched with purpose, believing they could stand against him, found themselves shattered before they could lift their blades. Thousands fell in an instant, their minds crumbling under the weight of his mere presence. Generals, once proud and fearless, wept like children before the horror of his gaze. It was destruction unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not a war, not a battle, an unraveling. Kael did not seek vengeance. He did not laugh as the world burned. He did not revel in the destruction. He simply was, and that was enough to bring the world to its knees. But amidst the chaos, amidst the fire and the ruin, a lone voice broke through. "Kael, my son, stop this." Liora. She stood before him, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling. She had traveled across the broken world, through the burning cities and the poisoned seas, to reach him. She had walked through the ruins of empires, stepping over the bodies of those who had once cursed his name. And now, she stood before him, not as a warrior, not as a queen, but as a mother. Kael turned, his crimson eyes, those eyes that had struck fear into the hearts of kings, finally meeting hers. For the first time, the storm hesitated. For the first time, the fire dimmed. For the first time, the boy inside the monster surfaced. "Mother," he whispered. The word was fragile, uncertain. It carried none of the power that had split mountains, none of the fury that had drowned cities. It was soft, broken, human. And in that moment, Liora saw the truth. Kael had never wanted to destroy the world. He had never sought to bring ruin. It had been forced upon him, shaped by those who feared him, those who sought to control him or destroy him. Every betrayal, every hunted night, every whispered curse had pushed him further and further into the abyss, until there was nowhere left for him to go but down. And yet, despite it all, he was still her son. She reached out, ignoring the heat, the crackling energy that still swirled around him. She placed a trembling hand against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin, the same warmth she had felt when he was a child, sleeping in her arms. "Come back to me, my son." Kael's hands clenched at his sides. The power, the fury, the raw storm that had erupted from him, it did not want to be contained. It resisted. The darkness that had coiled itself around him for so long did not wish to be silenced. But then, the impossible happened. The fire in his eyes flickered. The storm above them paused. And Kael took a breath. A single, trembling breath. The world held its own breath with him. The skies, still burning, seemed to wait. The seas, still poisoned, seemed to hush. The very earth, still trembling, seemed to listen. And in that moment, Kael was no longer the devil's son. He was simply Kael. But the world had already begun to break. The destruction could not be undone, the devastation could not be reversed. The world had cast him out, and in doing so, it had damned itself. The wounds he had inflicted upon the earth, upon the heavens, upon the seas, were too deep. Empires had crumbled, civilizations had perished, and even if Kael stopped now, there would be no going back. Liora knew this. Kael knew this. And yet, he still stopped. He did not know if there was still a place for him in this world. He did not know if there was anything left to save. But he knew one thing. He would not lose the one person who had never abandoned him. And so, as the flames flickered and the storm clouds began to dissipate, Kael, the boy, the monster, the harbinger of the end, stood beside his mother, uncertain, lost, but still standing. And somewhere, in the distant shadows, the devil watched. And he smiled. Chapter 7: The Price of Fate. The heavens trembled. The earth wept. And the abyss roared with fury. The gods themselves, silent for so long, finally intervened. They had watched as Kael's existence bent the fabric of the world, as his mere presence shattered the balance they had woven. They had seen the ruin, the fire, the devastation that followed his every step, and they could no longer stand idly by. A war unlike any before erupted across creation. It was not fought in cities or on battlefields, it raged through the very forces that governed existence. The skies tore open, revealing celestial legions descending upon the world, wielding weapons forged from starlight. The abyss, never willing to cede its claim, unleashed horrors beyond mortal comprehension, beings of shadow and chaos that twisted the land beneath them. And at the center of it all stood Kael. He did not fight for either side, nor did he seek dominion. He had never chosen his fate, yet fate had made its choice for him. His power, vast and unchecked, called to both heaven and hell, and they wanted him. The celestial host sought to erase him, to purge his existence from the world so that balance could be restored. The abyss sought to claim him, to mold him into their champion, the harbinger of the world's end. Kael stood alone. He fought, not out of hatred or vengeance, but because he had no choice. Blades of divine fire clashed against claws of pure darkness, the forces of creation and destruction locked in a struggle beyond the understanding of men. With each strike, mountains crumbled. With each cry, the oceans recoiled. And with each moment, the world edged closer to oblivion. Yet amid the chaos, there was one who had not abandoned him. Liora. She had crossed the lands devastated by his wrath, she had pleaded with the gods, she had called to the abyss, all for the sake of her son. And now, standing at the edge of the battlefield where existence itself threatened to unravel, she knew what had to be done. Kael was not the monster they feared. He was her son. And if the world could not see that, if neither gods nor demons would grant him peace, then she would find a way to save him herself. Even if it cost her everything. She stepped forward, her presence unnoticed amid the clash of titanic forces. The wind howled, carrying the cries of fallen angels and the roars of dying nightmares, but Liora did not falter. She did not possess the strength of warriors, nor the magic of the divine. She had only her love, her grief, and the certainty that no matter what the world had decided, Kael was not beyond saving. She reached him, her voice a whisper beneath the storm. "Kael!" He turned, crimson eyes flickering. For the first time, he looked lost. He had fought for so long, stood against so many, endured hatred, exile, and betrayal. And now, as the war raged around him, he saw the one person who had never turned away. The mother who had held him as a child, who had shielded him from the whispers of the world, who had defied the gods themselves to save him. Mother? Her hands trembled as she reached for him, brushing against his cheek, just as she had when he was young. The heat of his power, the raw force that had reduced civilizations to ruin, did not harm her. To her, he was still the boy she had cradled, the child she had sworn to protect. "I love you, Kael." A whisper. A promise. And then she took the blade. A single stroke, swift and unerring, the steel sinking into her own heart. The world seemed to freeze. Kael's breath caught, his body going rigid as the blood of the only person who had ever loved him spilled onto his hands. His mother, the only light in his darkness, the only warmth in his cold existence, was falling. His power surged, wild and unchecked, but she had known this would happen. She had prepared for it. As she collapsed into his arms, her blood, touched by her love, by the last remnants of humanity's mercy, bound him. His power faltered. His form wavered. The forces of heaven and hell paused, watching as Kael, the one they had all sought to control or destroy, began to fade. His cries were soundless, his horror endless. He tried to hold on, tried to resist, but the binding had already taken root. Liora's sacrifice had severed him from the world, had caged his very essence within the flow of her lifeblood. A prison beyond time, beyond space, beyond fate itself. And as her last breath left her lips, so too did Kael vanish. The war ended in an instant. The heavens withdrew, their judgment passed. The abyss recoiled, denied their champion. The world, scarred and broken, still stood, saved not by divine might nor infernal wrath, but by the love of a mother who refused to abandon her son. And in the silence that followed, the devil watched. For the first time, he did not smile. For the first time, he mourned. Kael's name was lost to history. His existence, once feared by all, became nothing more than a whisper in the deepest corners of nightmares. The world forgot him, the empires that had once trembled at his presence crumbling into dust, their descendants never knowing the name of the boy who had nearly ended it all. But some say his story is not over. Some say that, even now, there are places where the air grows cold without reason, where the shadows seem to move of their own accord. Some say that his whispers still echo in the dark, that his prison is not as strong as it once was. And some believe that, one day, he will return. Not as a monster. Not as a savior. But as something beyond both. And on that day, the world will tremble once more when the devil's son walks among men again.